Well, the 1963 wasn't the first year Pontiac Grand Prix, but it is one of, if not the most iconic Pontiac Grand Prix that was ever produced. The Grand Prix was introduced in the 1962 model year, but this 1963 featured all new styling that had a number of new Pontiac features that would be used for some period of time. It also was, in general, a mechanically excellent car, except for one component, which we're going to feature on this video, and it had just a beautiful interior to accompany its exterior looks. So let's talk a little bit more about the top 10 facts you didn't know about the 1963 Pontiac Grand Prix. And at number 10, we have the John DeLorean. Yes, of the DeLorean Motor Company had a significant influence on this car. Back in this time frame that the Grand Prix was being developed, John DeLorean was the head of Pontiac Advanced Engineering. He would later go on to become the Pontiac General Manager for a number of years in the mid-1960s, helping spearhead cars like the Pontiac GTO as well as the Firebird. For his efforts, he was rewarded and promoted to become the General Manager of Chevrolet and eventually an Executive Vice President of General Motors. Unfortunately, DeLorean kind of soured on the General Motors culture in the early 1970s and decided, rather than try to stay and ascend to the presidency, that he would end up starting his own car company, the DeLorean Motor Company. Interestingly, an individual who would become a president of General Motors, Pete Estes, was the individual who preceded John DeLorean as the general manager of Pontiac. And when Estes left, that's when DeLorean became the new general manager of Pontiac. And I should say Estes left to other roles in the company. And as I mentioned, he would later ascend to the presidency of General Motors, retiring in the early 1980s. And at number 9, we have that the 63 Grand Prix represented the first of the stacked headlight Pontiacs. Now, the Grand Prix for 1963 wasn't the only stacked headlight Pontiac, but this was the introductory model year for this look, and I think it's an especially handsome look for Pontiacs overall. It would continue on until the 1968 model year, when Pontiac would revise its front end and would never be seen again on Pontiacs. But the 63 Grand Prix, as you can see here, has this beautiful front end theme. Notice that it says Grand Prix spelled out in block lettering on the side of the fender there, as opposed to the GP logo in the grille. That GP logo would come about in 1964, but for 1963, there was no such logo in the grille. You just got this little Grand Prix script on the side. And you also got the funky pod mirror on the fender that would continue generally for one more model year. In 1965, that mirror would be brought closer. I think it just looks kind of strange hanging way out there on the fender. But again, this would be the first of the stacked headlight Pontiacs, and interestingly, the 1965 full-size Pontiacs would kind of repeat this theme of the stacked headlights, where you have the fender that kind of goes back and behind the headlamps, and you have a nacelle around the headlights. I actually think it was even better done for 1965. But it all started with the 1963 model year, and the Grand Prix was one of the Pontiacs to have this particular stacked headlight front end. And at number 8, we have that the 1963 had a concave rear window. Now, you have to remember that during this time frame, this was the early days of even having curved side glass on cars. That was started by Imperial in the late 1950s, I believe. But many cars still just had flat side glass. But on the 1963 Grand Prix, Pontiac had an interesting styling touch, and that was this concave rear window. You can see it's got this beautiful arc to it, and it gives the rear a certain level of dimension that helps offset the otherwise very upright kind of posture of the 1963. And that posture was really predicated on the Grand Prix getting inspiration in terms of styling from another vehicle that we're going to talk about in a little bit, a non-General Motors vehicle, believe it or not, but a seminal car of the early 1960s. But this concave rear window is one of the hallmarks of the 63 Grand Prix. And of course, as time would go on, General Motors would start doing some interesting things with the rear windows or backlights on cars. Chevrolet would have a concave rear window in the late 1960s, going all the way through to the 1973 model year, for instance. But one of the first cars to have this beautiful feature was this 63 Grand Prix. Next, at number 7, we have that the Grand Prix had a tachometer standard only on manual transmission cars. Now, here's a 421 4-speed powered Grand Prix. And you'll notice that the car has a tachometer kind of added on, if you will, to the left side of the instrument panel next to the speedometer. And that tachometer was something that only came standard on the manual transmission cars. If you got an automatic with a center console, you would get a vacuum gauge in the middle, which of course was very helpful. I never understood why they put so many vacuum gauges in cars or fuel economy gauges. Doesn't the driver know that if he or she has their foot on the accelerator pedal, like pretty significantly, that is not a great position of the accelerator in terms of fuel economy? Not sure why vacuum gauges were so popular for so many years, but they were. And that's what you got in the automatic transmission cars. But the manual transmission cars, you got this tachometer. And the only thing about these engines, the 389s that were standard in these Grand Prix that made 303 horsepower, you could get an optional 2-barrel 389. You could get a series of 421 engines with 4-barrel carburetors or 3 2-barrel carburetors. And they're great engines. They're wonderful engines overall. The only thing I would say is you don't want to rev them north of 5,000 RPM because you start to get valve float, and there's just really no advantage to it. So they kind of top out around 5,000 RPM or so on these Grand Prix. But overall, you only got the tachometer because I guess you only needed it if you had a manual transmission car, and you got that beautiful vacuum gauge if you had an automatic. At number 6, we have that the Grand Prix was based on the Catalina wheelbase. Now, what do I mean by that? This was a time frame during which the full-size Pontiacs actually had 2 different wheelbases. There was the shorter wheelbase for the Catalina and the Grand Prix, and the larger wheelbase for the Bonneville as well as the Star Chief. The Catalina and the Grand Prix rode atop 120-inch wheelbase. The longer wheelbase was 123 inches. So depending upon which Pontiac you bought, that would dictate which wheelbase that you had. Many people didn't know that there were actually 2 wheelbases of these Pontiacs. Now, there was some other interesting equipment that came on the short wheelbase Pontiacs as opposed to the long wheelbase Pontiacs. But we're going to save that for, well, let's wait for a few more on the list here. However, the short wheelbase Pontiacs, I think, give the cars just a wonderful stance. And of course, you save a little bit of weight too, given the shorter wheelbase and less sheet metal. So it made the car a little bit more sporty and handled a bit better. But that would persist, the 2 wheelbases, for a number of years, even all the way into the 1970s. Really wasn't until the mid-1970s that Pontiac would collapse its lineup into a single wheelbase, and then that would continue on for a number of years into the future. And now on to number 5, and that is that the 63 Grand Prix actually had real walnut trim on the interior. As I said that right, this is real walnut trim. This isn't fake. This is actually real, and it gives the Grand Prix interior just this gorgeous look. I think this is one of the most beautiful interiors that Pontiac ever put together, especially with that real walnut trim coupled with the lucite steering wheel, as well as those kind of driver-centric gauges that are in the middle of the instrument panel there. And of course, you got the Pontiac grab handle. But Pontiac's interiors during this time frame, really until I would say about 1968 was when they started going downhill, were just absolute pieces of art. Not only was the theme beautiful, but the materials were very high quality, especially for what was effectively a mid-price car. It was kind of unheard of to have real wood trim on such a vehicle. Even some upper-end cars didn't have real wood trim, even for a number of years. But here it is on a Pontiac, and like I said, it continued for a few years after this. And after about 1967 into the 1968 model year, the interior started going downhill, unfortunately. And they kind of kept going downhill for a number of years, all the way into the early 1970s. I don't think the 1971 Pontiac interior really is anything to write home about. And maybe you could say that in 1977, when those were redesigned, that the interiors got marginally better, but they still weren't all that great for a number of years until they came out with the beautiful Parisian Brome interior with the biscuit pleated seats. That's pretty sweet in the 1980s. But other than that, this is kind of the pinnacle of Pontiac interior design, and it certainly is in part because of the real walnut trim. And at number 4, we have an unfortunate consequence of the Grand Prix bringing on the short wheelbase for the Pontiacs, and that is that If you got an automatic transmission equipped Grand Prix, it came with the rotohydromatic transmission. Now, the rotohydromatic was a transmission that was developed by Oldsmobile and employed on all full-size Oldsmobiles from 1961 to 1964, as well as F-85s. It was also used at GM's Australia subsidiary called Holden. And then to try to get some incremental volume, GM management forced Pontiac to employ it as well. And Pontiac elected to put it in its short wheelbase cars. So the Star Chief and the Bonneville did not get the rotohydramatics, but the Grand Prix and Catalina did for the 1961 to 64 model years. And this is just especially unfortunate because here you have like a Grand Prix, a very sporty vehicle, and you have a terrible automatic transmission. From both the standpoint of reliability, these transmissions were known to be very failure prone at even as low as 20 or 30,000 miles. So you have a poor reliability record for them, and then they just shift horribly. They have this very strange 1 to 2 shift in particular where the first gear is kind of normal. The car starts out normal, and it does provide good acceleration for the vehicle. But then as it executes the 1 to 2 shift, it's also in conjunction with the shift executing almost a mechanical lockup of the fluid coupling as well. So it goes into a direct drive between the engine and the transmission. And the result is you get these power pulses from the transmission, and the RPM drops pretty significantly because it's not only a shift, but also, in effect, a mechanical lockup executing in second gear as well. It's just super clunky and an awful, awful transmission. I would say if you find a 63 Grand Prix, make sure that the transmission has been rebuilt at some point in its life because it will fail, and it probably will even fail again despite having been rebuilt. You just have to budget for a transmission. And I would say that if somebody converted their 63 Grand Prix to have something other than the rotohydromatic, like a turbohydromatic 350, I view that as a net bonus because even though it's not original, it's going to drive a lot better than the original transmission car. They're just so clunky and not very reliable, as I mentioned, especially when they were behind powerful engines like a 389 with a 3.2 barrel carburetor or a 421. They really just didn't last. And thankfully, they were only used in the 1961 to 64 model years in the U.S. And Oldsmobile, kind of, why would they develop this transmission? Well, it was a cheaper, lighter weight, lower cost alternative to the big full-size hydromatic that other General Motors vehicles got. But I would say that it was kind of unquestionably a failure. Next, let's move on to number 3, and that is that you could equip your 1963 Grand Prix with Pontiac's beautiful 8-lug wheels. Now, what is so special about these 8-lug wheels, different from other cars? Well, first of all, let me just say that Pontiac introduced these partway through the 1960 model year, and they continued as an optional equipment generally on Pontiacs through the 1968 model year. As disc brakes came into vogue in the late 1960s, well, then the 8-lug wheels just went by the wayside for 1969 and beyond. So what is the 8-lug wheel? Well, it's actually a wheel. There's an outer rim, as you can see in this picture, associated with it. And then there's an inner portion of the wheel to which that rim bolts up. And then on the inside of that rim is where the brake drum effectively is. The inside of this rim is the brake drum. So here's a better picture of what I mean. Notice here the mechanic has this tire off and the 8-lug is separated from the brake drum. You'll notice that the wheel looks kind of funny here. It's literally just this rim where you bolt up the drum, which is a structural member of the wheel, to the rim. And then obviously inside the drum you have the surface where the shoes would ride, and that would help stop the car. So kind of a neat look, an innovative design as well, but something, like I said, that would just go out after the 1968 model year because disc brakes became the thing to have, and these are obviously drum brakes. Drum brakes aren't bad. In fact, some of these vehicles, like the 8-lug cars, and I would say actually Buick's aluminum fin drum that they came out with, they're great brakes overall, but disc brakes are better. And so as time went on, the auto industry just moved toward that, and then the 8-lugs went away as well as their beautiful look. Next, at number 2, we have that the Pontiac Grand Prix for the 1963 model year was inspired not by another General Motors vehicle or a foreign car, but actually by the 1961 Lincoln Continental. Yes, I said that right. The 63 Grand Prix was General Motors' response, in effect, to the 61 Lincoln Continental. And if you take a look at the 63 Grand Prix, you'll notice that it has these very upright sides and upright posture and a minimal amount of chrome on it. And that's because, again, it was inspired by the 1961 Continental. Now, the 63 Grand Prix wouldn't be the only General Motors car that would be inspired by the 61 Continental. Another one would, in fact, be over at the Cadillac division, and that is the 1965 Cadillacs with the stacked headlights. Interestingly, Cadillac went for the stacked headlights in 1965, just like Pontiac went for them in 1963. And I think the 65 Cadillac is one of the most beautiful ever produced because it's just so clean. It doesn't have all that much chrome. The sides are just beautifully surfaced and simple. It's a simple car, and you just compare and contrast the 65 Cadillac to the Cadillacs of a few years prior to that with all these fins and skeg lines and a lot of visual theater on them. The 65 doesn't have a lot of visual theater, but it's still an absolutely beautiful car. And both the 65 Cadillac and the 63 Grand Prix took their inspiration from a Ford product of anything, a 1961 Continental. Now at number one, we're going to take a look at what the 63 Grand Prix could have looked like with some alternate design proposals. When the 63 Grand Prix was being designed, one of the main designers for the car was a man by the name of Bill Porter. Now, Bill Porter would go on to lead Pontiac design in the late 1960s after Jack Humbert would be the lead designer in the mid-1960s. Bill Porter worked on and led the design of a number of Pontiacs, including the 1970.5 Firebird as well as the 1970 Pontiac GTO. And he would lead Pontiac design for a number of years after that, including leading it for the 1970 full-size Pontiacs, EGADs, as well as the 1971 full-size Pontiacs, and for a number of years after that. In his later career, Bill would move to the Buick division, and he would be responsible for cars like the 1995 Riviera, along with a gentleman by the name of Eric Clough, as well as Andy Hansel. But let's now take a look at a few design proposals, alternate proposals for the 1963 Grand Prix. Take a look here at this initial proposal. This is obviously before Pontiac decided to go to the stacked headlight look, but you can see a little bit of inspiration from the 61 Continental in the relatively flat body sides that this car has, which mirror the final production version. I do enjoy that the grille kind of spills all the way around the side of the vehicle, something that I don't think any Pontiac would really have, certainly during this time frame. So it's an interesting proposal, but obviously was shelved in favor of the stacked headlight design on the 63 Grand Prix. And this photograph shows an alternate proposal for the 63 Grand Prix rear end. Of course, the 63 Grand Prix would have this kind of hidden tail light that was hidden into this rib design, but you can see that Pontiac was considering an alternate, I would call it more conventional design for the 63 Grand Prix rear with a standard taillight and then some Pontiac script in the middle. I think they made the right choice with the 63 Grand Prix rear end. I have to say, though, that the 1965 Grand Prix rear end is actually my favorite. I think that was the best of the hidden taillight rear ends from Pontiac. So what did you think about this special? What was the most interesting fact? Put a comment in the comment section. Let me know if you liked it. And if you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe. It's free. Push the button with the picture of the 1967 Riviera front end in the middle there. Thanks again for watching.